A horrific murder of a pregnant mom and her two young daughters back in 2018, getting a new in-depth look. Some of you may recognize the man I'm going to show you. There he is, right? Chris Watts. He's currently serving life in prison. While you may not know his name, you might remember what this guy did. Back in August of 2018, he killed his wife, Shanann, in their Colorado home, buried her body at a job site at the oil company where he worked. He also drove their two daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, to that same oil site, smothered them, and hid their bodies in giant oil tanks. And right now, the #1 video on Netflix is a documentary about the case. It's called The Family Next Door, An American Murder. It tells the story of the Watts family through the words and personal videos and texts of Shanann Watts. Take a look at this clip.
Hey guys, my name is Shanann. I just want you to know a little bit of my story. I went through one of the darkest times of my life, and then I met Chris. And he's the best thing that has ever happened to me.
How you doing? How's it going? There was no note or anything?
I don't know what to do right now.
Court TV special contributor Ashley Banfield has been digging through this story for years now, and I know now you've learned some new information about Christopher Watts and his reaction to this renewed interest in his crimes. What's going on here, Ashley?
Yeah, Vinny, this was quite a documentary. I thought I knew everything. I covered that case start to finish in 2018. And, you know, I was just so sickened and saddened by it, as I'm sure the rest of America was. But those Netflix images of their wedding, that was something new. I think that was shared personally from Shanann Watts' family, the Ruszczyk family. But these pictures just sort of, I found to be so jarring. I guess not the least of which there was Chris Watts at a different weight as well. He had dropped, gosh, I think 60 pounds or something by the time he went on his murderous family annihilation. But also just to see them in such happy times and to know that it wouldn't be long after that, that she and her two children and the baby she was carrying would all be wiped out by this man.
August 13th, 2018, 5:27 a.m. Frederick, Colorado. A quiet street in a small town. Police lights flash against the walls of modest homes. A stretcher rolls forward, the body beneath the sheet hidden from the world, but not from the whispers spreading through the neighborhood. Behind curtains, neighbors watch in silence, their faces pressed against glass. They said it was love. They said it was family. But love, when it turns into betrayal, can become the deadliest weapon of all. The pause hangs, heavier than the sirens. What would you do if the family you married into never wanted you, and the man you trusted most made sure you never survived? Every true crime story begins with a life, not a crime. And in this story, that life belonged to Shanann Catherine Watts. To understand her, to understand the weight of the loss, you have to step back before the headlines, before the trial, before the cameras. You have to know who she was, what she survived, and why she fought so hard for the life she built. Shanann was born on January 10, 1984, in Aberdeen, North Carolina. The daughter of Frank and Sandra Ruszczyk, she grew up in a family that valued love and persistence, even when money was tight and life was often demanding. Her parents worked hard to provide for her and her brother, Frankie, instilling in their children the belief that no obstacle was insurmountable if you had faith and resilience. But Shanann's childhood wasn't without its shadows. From an early age, she battled health struggles that would follow her for the rest of her life. Years later, she would be diagnosed with lupus, an incurable autoimmune disease that drained her body of strength and tested her spirit daily. For many, it would have been reason enough to slow down, to shrink back from the world. But for Shanann, illness became fuel. It gave her urgency, drive, and a determination to live fully in every moment she was given. She refused to let the disease write her story. Those who knew her described her as strong-willed and independent, but also deeply caring. Shanann was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, who sent supportive messages when someone was struggling, who pushed her friends to believe in themselves when they doubted everything. That loyalty made her unforgettable, and it also made her someone people leaned on heavily. By her 20s, Shanann had faced setbacks that might have broken another person. A first marriage ended in divorce, leaving her both cautious and determined. She struggled with debt and health challenges, but she refused to collapse under the weight of them. Instead, she bought her own home in North Carolina, a two-story house that she renovated herself. She often said that house was her symbol of survival, proof that she could stand on her own, proof that no one could take away what she fought to build. But survival alone was not enough for Shannon. What she wanted most was a family, not just a house filled with furniture, but a home filled with laughter. She wanted children. She wanted love that would last. And she believed, despite the pain she had endured, that it was still possible. By 2010, Shannon was thriving professionally. She had joined Lavelle, a health and wellness company, where her ambition and natural charisma quickly made her successful. She sold products, but more importantly, she sold belief. Belief that people could feel better, live healthier, and change their lives. Social media became her platform. She shared her journey openly, documenting both her victories and her struggles, building a following of people who admired her resilience. Her posts showed a woman who seemed in control, a woman who knew who she was, and a woman who was determined never to let life's obstacles stop her. But behind the polished posts was the raw truth of her daily life. Fatigue that never fully left her, pain that flared without warning, and the quiet loneliness of nights where she wondered if love would ever come again. Shannon wanted a partner who could accept her not in spite of her illness, but alongside it. Someone who would walk with her in the hardest moments, not run from them. And in 2010, a friend request on Facebook would open that door. Christopher Lee Watts was born on May 16, 1985, in Spring Lake, North Carolina. To many, he seemed the quiet counterpart to Shannon's energy. Where she was outgoing and driven, Chris was reserved, measured, and unassuming. And it was that difference, her spark against his silence, that drew them together. Chris grew up the son of Cindy and Ronnie Watts. His father was easygoing, a man who worked steadily and avoided conflict when he could. His mother, Cindy, was more outspoken, strong-willed, protective, and often critical of anyone who threatened the bond she believed she had with her son. Together, they raised Chris in a modest, middle-class home, teaching him the values of loyalty and family. But loyalty, in their home, often meant control. From a young age, Chris learned that approval came at a cost. Cindy had expectations about how he should behave, who he should bring into their lives, and what kind of woman was acceptable for him to marry. To her, a wife should be gentle, compliant, and family-oriented in ways she approved of. Any woman who was too independent, too outspoken, or too different would never fit into her vision. Chris, quiet by nature, rarely pushed back. Instead, he kept his head down, avoided confrontation, and did what was expected of him. By his mid-20s, Chris had built a steady career as a mechanic, working with cars and engines, fascinated by how machines functioned with order and precision. Friends and colleagues described him as polite, dependable, and reserved. He wasn't someone who demanded attention, but he was someone you could rely on. And yet, beneath that quiet surface was a man who rarely voiced his own desires, who allowed others, especially his mother, to shape the boundaries of his life. It was against this backdrop that Chris first encountered Shannon in 2010. Their meeting wasn't dramatic. No chance collision on a busy street. No cinematic spark in a crowded room. It was a Facebook friend request. At the time, Shannon almost ignored it. She was sick, recovering from a period of intense health struggles, and wasn't sure she had the energy to let someone new in. But Chris persisted. He commented on her posts, checked in when she shared updates about her illness, and reached out quietly but consistently. Shannon later admitted she nearly canceled their first date. She was exhausted and uncertain, but she went. And what she found was a man who, unlike others, seemed patient. He didn't question her illness. He didn't make her feel weak. He simply listened. He sat with her. He showed up. And for a woman who had carried so much alone, that presence felt like relief. The relationship progressed quickly. Shannon began to trust him with the parts of her life she rarely revealed. He drove her to doctor's appointments, waited with her during treatments, and proved himself steady in the ways she needed most. For Chris, Shannon's ambition and strength were unlike anything he had experienced. She was bold where he was quiet, decisive where he was hesitant. Together, they seemed to balance one another. By the time they married in 2012, Shannon believed she had found the man who would walk beside her through sickness and health, through the chaos of parenting, through every obstacle. And for a while, it seemed that way. They built a home in Frederick, Colorado, welcomed 2 daughters, and presented to the world the image of a perfect young family. But beneath that image, tension was already growing. Cindy Watts had never truly accepted Shannon. From the beginning, she believed her daughter-in-law was controlling, too outspoken, too dominant in Chris's life. Ronnie remained quiet, but his silence spoke volumes. And Chris, caught between his mother and his wife, chose silence as well. Silence that allowed resentment to fester. Silence that left Shannon fighting battles she could not see clearly, but that she could feel pressing against her life. And it was in that silence that the seeds of destruction were planted. Shannon believed she had built a family rooted in love. Chris believed he could keep peace by saying nothing. Cindy believed she could hold on to her son by never letting go. It would take years for those tensions to explode. But by the time they did, it was already too late. Every marriage carries more than vows between 2 people. It carries the weight of family expectations, the tension of blending 2 histories, and the fragile hope that acceptance will grow over time. For Chris and Shannon Watts, that hope was never fully realized, because from the beginning, Cindy and Ronnie Watts looked at Shannon and saw a woman they could not accept. Cindy believed Shannon was not the right kind of woman for her son. She thought she was too controlling, too outspoken, and too determined to run her household her way. To Cindy, Shannon didn't fit the image she held of a gentle, compliant daughter-in-law who would keep family harmony by staying in her place. Ronnie, more reserved, rarely voiced strong opinions, but his silence often followed Cindy's disapproval like a shadow. Together, they created an atmosphere that left Shannon feeling more like an intruder than a family member. Shannon tried to bridge the gap. She offered help at gatherings, brought thoughtful gifts, and involved Cindy and Ronnie in updates about Bella and Celeste, hoping they would embrace her if they saw her dedication as a wife and mother. Friends remember her talking about it often, saying she just wanted to belong. She wanted peace, not just for herself, but for her daughters, because she believed children deserve the love of grandparents on both sides. But the wall never came down. It grew higher with each visit. The sharpest example came in the summer of 2018, during a family trip to North Carolina. Shannon had asked Cindy not to keep certain foods in the house, because Celeste, her youngest, suffered from severe food allergies. Shannon's concern was not negotiable. It was about her daughter's safety. But Cindy dismissed it, insisting her grandchildren were too sheltered and that Shannon exaggerated their conditions. The disagreement came to a head when Cindy served a dish containing nuts. Shannon was horrified. She confronted her mother-in-law directly, accusing her of endangering Celeste's life. Cindy pushed back, arguing Shannon was overreacting. Voices rose, patience snapped, and the room split in 2. Shannon left in tears. Chris stood frozen, caught between his wife and his mother, saying almost nothing. That moment became known later as the nut incident. For Shannon, it was more than a fight about food. It was proof that her mother-in-law's disapproval was no longer hidden in silences or subtle remarks. It was open, blatant, and dangerous. To Shannon, it felt like rejection not just of her, but of her daughters. And that wound cut deeper than any words ever could. When love and loyalty collide, which one do you betray first? The woman you vowed to protect, or the parents who shaped your life? Chris never answered that question out loud. Instead, he chose silence. To him, silence felt like safety, a way to avoid confrontation, a way to keep peace without taking sides. But silence is never neutral. In choosing not to defend Shannon, he left her standing alone, battling disapproval from a family that should have embraced her. In Cindy's eyes, his silence was quiet agreement. In Shannon's eyes, it was abandonment. Shannon confided to friends that she felt crushed by the constant rejection. Nicole Atkinson later remembered Shannon calling her after the incident, voice shaking, saying she didn't know how much more she could take. She told her that Cindy's behavior made her feel like an outsider, like no matter how hard she tried, she would never be good enough. Shannon said she wanted Chris to step up, to defend her, to prove that his loyalty was with the family they had built together. But Chris avoided the confrontation. He reassured her softly, told her things would get better, But when the time came to speak to his parents, he stayed quiet. That quietness, which had once made Shannon feel safe, now felt like betrayal. The man who had once been her refuge was now the man who left her exposed. Her patience wore thin, and her attempts at reconciliation grew heavier. She was already fighting her health, already managing the weight of raising two small children, already carrying the burden of keeping a home afloat. Now, she was also carrying the exhausting battle of trying to win over people determined to resist her. Family disapproval is not a wound that heals on its own. It lingers, sharpens, and spreads. For Shannon, every gathering became a test, every phone call a reminder, every silence from Chris another confirmation that she was standing in this fight alone. For Cindy, every interaction reinforced her belief that Shannon was wrong for her son. And for Chris, silence became his only shield, but it was a shield that protected no one. This was the fracture that grew year by year. Not with explosions, not with dramatic showdowns every day, but with steady erosion. The quiet moments of disrespect, the arguments left unresolved, the loyalty left unspoken. These were the cracks in the foundation of the Watts family. Cracks that would one day give way to something unthinkable. Because silence, once a refuge, had become a weapon, and it was a weapon that would one day turn deadly. Marriage does not happen in isolation. When two people stand together, they bring with them the weight of their families, the traditions they inherit, and the expectations that refuse to stay behind. For Chris and Shannon Watts, that truth revealed itself early, and the disapproval Shannon felt from her in-laws never softened. Instead, it hardened into an invisible barrier that shaped her marriage in ways she could not ignore. From the start, Cindy Watts carried an opinion about Shannon that she rarely disguised. Her remarks were delivered calmly, but they cut deeply. She would question how Shannon parented Bella and Celeste, suggesting she was too strict or too protective, often making these comments in front of others. On birthdays or holidays, when warmth should have filled the room, her words came cold. "You don't let them just be kids," or "You worry too much." To Shannon, these weren't suggestions from a caring grandmother. They were judgments, reminders that she had never been accepted as the right partner for her son. Ronnie, quieter by nature, rarely offered his opinion. But silence has its own power. When Cindy spoke, Ronnie almost never intervened. He didn't temper her words, didn't reassure Shannon afterward, didn't provide balance. His stillness seemed to confirm his wife's view, and Shannon began to feel that disapproval was not coming from one parent, but from both. The hostility did not stay hidden behind closed doors. At gatherings, the tension was plain. One Christmas, Shannon noticed that her name had been left off of the gift tags Cindy prepared for the family. Bella and Celeste's names were there, Chris's too, but not hers. It was a small detail, yet it stung deeply. To Shannon, it was another way of being told she didn't belong. She later confided to Nicole Atkinson, her closest friend, that the gesture was more painful than shouting. Nicole didn't hesitate in her reply. "If they hate you now, it only gets worse after marriage." Shannon held on to Nicole's warning, but she still tried to make peace. She believed love could change hearts. She invited Cindy and Ronnie to birthdays, encouraged them to spend time with the girls, and sent them photos to keep them involved. Each time, she hoped it might be the step that would bring them closer. But instead of progress, she was met with the same cool remarks and silent walls. Every attempt to bridge the gap ended with her feeling more like an outsider. Chris responded the only way he knew how, with reassurances that carried little weight. "They'll come around," he told Shannon, again and again. "Just give it time." His voice was steady, but his actions said otherwise. When conflict rose, he withdrew. When Shannon needed him to defend her, he grew quiet. His silence wasn't born of cruelty. It was the pattern he had learned since childhood, when avoiding confrontation had been his only way to keep peace in his home. For him, silence felt safe. For Shannon, it felt like betrayal. Because silence, in a marriage, does not protect both sides. It chooses one, even when the person speaking it claims it doesn't. The weight of rejection pressed down on Shannon. Already managing her health, her career, and the constant demands of raising two small children, she now carried the exhausting burden of trying to win over a family that seemed determined to resist her. Social media showed the polished version of her life, the smiling photographs, the carefully worded posts of gratitude and joy. But behind those images was a woman tired of fighting for approval, tired of waiting for Chris to stand firmly in her corner. Nicole later recalled that Shannon would call after visits with his parents, her voice heavy, saying she had done everything she could, and it still wasn't enough. The nut incident in the summer of 2018 was the clearest sign of this divide. Shannon had made it clear that Celeste's nut allergy was life-threatening, and she expected Cindy to respect that. But Cindy dismissed it, offering food that contained nuts during a visit. For Shannon, this was not just a disagreement. It was a direct violation of her child's safety. She confronted Cindy in anger and fear, and Cindy fought back, insisting Shannon was overprotective. Voices rose, and Shannon left the confrontation shaken and furious. Chris, again, said almost nothing. The moment revealed more than just a clash of personalities. It exposed how deeply Cindy's rejection ran, and how unwilling Chris was to intervene. For Shannon, the rejection was no longer subtle. It was open. It was direct, and it felt like a battle she was fighting without an ally. The disapproval from Cindy, the silence from Ronnie, and the quiet withdrawal of Chris left Shannon isolated within her marriage. She wanted unity. She wanted peace. She wanted her daughters to know love from all sides of their family. But what she received instead was coldness, absence, and empty reassurances. A family divided does not always break in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it fractures slowly, with quiet words and unfinished arguments, until the distance becomes unbridgeable. Shannon believed she was fighting for love. Cindy believed she was fighting for her son. And Chris, caught in the middle, chose silence, not realizing that silence itself was a choice. And in the end, that silence would prove far more dangerous than anyone imagined. Weddings are often remembered in photographs, in posed smiles, and carefully arranged moments that capture the image of unity. On November 3, 2012, Shannon and Chris Watts stood at the center of their ceremony in North Carolina, framed by friends, relatives, and hope. Shannon glowed in a strapless white gown, her eyes locked on Chris, her smile unshaken even as she walked with the weight of lupus pressing on her body. Chris stood in a dark suit, quiet and steady, his face difficult to read but his presence constant. To most of the guests, it was a celebration, two young people in love, beginning their life together. But if you looked closely, the cracks were visible even on that day. When the photographer gathered family for pictures, Cindy Watts refused to move toward Shannon. She kept a deliberate space between them, stiff in posture and tight in expression. In some photos, her absence is glaring. In others, her presence is cold, her arms folded while Shannon leaned forward with a bride's warmth. Ronnie, quiet as always, filled the frame but not the moment. He smiled faintly, but he did nothing to close the gap. Chris noticed, but said nothing. Shannon noticed too, and later confided to a friend that the absence of warmth in those pictures hurt more than any words could have. At the reception, Shannon excused herself for several minutes, stepping into the restroom to compose herself. A guest later remembered seeing her reapply her makeup with a determined hand, whispering to her reflection, "This is my day. Don't let them ruin it." She returned to the room with her smile intact, determined to dance, to laugh, and to hold on to the hope that love could conquer disapproval. To Shannon, this day was about Chris, not about Cindy's coldness or Ronnie's silence. She told friends afterward that she refused to let negativity overshadow her vows. But deep down, the wound was there. Even as she smiled for the cameras, there were cracks no one could ignore. The early months of their marriage seemed to confirm her hope. Chris was steady, dependable, and present in the ways Shannon needed most. When fatigue from lupus kept her in bed, he quietly took care of household chores. When she struggled with the side effects of medication, he cooked simple meals and stayed by her side. Once, after a particularly difficult day, he surprised her with a handwritten note on the kitchen counter that read, "I love you more every day. We'll get through this together." Shannon kept it folded inside her planner, a reminder that her husband was not just supportive but invested in their life together. The honeymoon stage carried warmth. They shared meals at their favorite diner, took evening walks through their neighborhood, and planned their future with the kind of optimism that colors the early years of marriage. Shannon documented much of it online, posting photos, sharing updates, writing heartfelt captions about how grateful she felt for Chris. Friends described her as happier, lighter, more at peace than they had seen her in years. For a time, it seemed as though the weight of family disapproval had been pushed into the background by the force of their bond. But those fractures were never gone. They appeared whenever Chris's parents entered the picture. Cindy continued to deliver remarks with a cool edge, framing them as casual but leaving Shannon stung. She questioned decisions about the children, doubted Shanann's choices about her health, and kept her distance in moments that called for closeness. Ronnie, true to form, stayed silent. He offered no criticism, but also no comfort. His absence of voice left Shannon with the same conclusion: she was not welcome. Chris responded as he always had, with silence. To him, it felt like a shield. He believed that by saying little, he could keep peace between the two women he loved. In his mind, silence was safety. But to Shannon, that silence was abandonment. It left her to carry the conflict alone, standing exposed in a marriage where she should have been protected. She wanted Chris to speak up, to set boundaries, to insist on respect. Instead, he reassured her with soft words when they were alone. They'll come around. Just give it time. Time did not heal. It calcified. And though Shannon clung to hope, the evidence showed otherwise. The photographs from that wedding day still exist. Shannon radiant, Chris steady, Cindy stiff and distant. To most people, they look like simple family pictures. But for Shannon, they became symbols of a truth she could not escape. She had married not only Chris, but his silence, his family, and their refusal to accept her. And behind every smile that day was a secret Shannon couldn't see, a secret that would one day unravel everything she believed she had built. From the outside, Chris and Shannon Watts looked like the perfect couple in the perfect home. After their wedding, they moved to Frederick, Colorado, into a spacious two-story house on Saratoga Trail. The neighborhood was new, full of young families, trimmed lawns, and quiet streets. Shannon filled the home with photographs, organized shelves, and laughter from her daughters, Bella and Celeste. On social media, she documented everything, from birthday parties to bedtime stories. To anyone watching, it was the image of a family who had it all. But images can mislead. Behind the smiling videos and smiling neighbors was a marriage already carrying cracks from its foundation. Shannon still longed for acceptance from Cindy and Ronnie Watts, but every call, every visit, every holiday reinforced the same reality. She was not welcome in their eyes. Cindy's remarks about her parenting and spending habits never softened, and Ronnie's silence never offered comfort. They didn't see her strength as determination. They saw it as control. Chris, meanwhile, was beginning to change. His quietness, once a refuge for Shannon, grew into something heavier. At first, it looked like responsibility. He started taking firm control over the household finances, insisting bills be managed his way, questioning Shannon's purchases, and pressing her to scale back. He told her it was about stability, about protecting the family, but gradually it meant her choices carried less weight. Soon, it stretched beyond money. He hinted that certain friends were bad influences, and when Shannon reached out to them less, he never hid his relief. Then he began commenting on how often she spoke with her own parents. "We need space," he told her gently, but what he really meant was distance. This is how manipulation begins, not with shouting, but with whispers that slowly close doors, until the person being silenced doesn't notice how much space they've lost. Shannon noticed the shift in her heart before she admitted it aloud. In private journals, she wrote about the weight she carried. In one entry, she scribbled, "He makes decisions for me, but calls it protection. I feel like a guest in my own marriage." In another, late at night after an argument, she wrote, "I don't know when I stopped having a voice." The words were raw, unfiltered, written by a woman who shared joy online but recorded her pain on paper. Chris's parents reinforced this pattern. During phone calls, Cindy praised him for being strong and standing up for yourself. Once, when Shannon wasn't in the room, Cindy told Chris, "You're finally keeping her in line." To her, his control was proof he wasn't being dominated by the woman she distrusted. Ronnie said little, as always, but his quiet chuckle on the line was enough to make Chris believe he was doing what they wanted. What Cindy saw as strength, Shannon felt as erasure. For Chris, this control served multiple purposes. It eased the financial strain their household carried. It calmed his parents' criticism, and it gave him the comfort of silence he had relied on his whole life. But for Shanann, it was suffocation. Still, Shanann fought to hold everything together. She devoted herself to her daughters, planning birthday parties with homemade decorations, filming bedtime songs, and keeping their lives filled with warmth. She traveled for her Louvel business, building a community of women who admired her energy and drive. She posted online about gratitude and love, sometimes with long captions about Chris, calling him her partner, her steady hand. To those watching from outside, she looked unstoppable, a woman balancing motherhood, business, and marriage with effortless grace. But her private world told a different story. When friends asked how she was doing, she often brushed off her exhaustion with a smile. Yet Nicole Atkinson, her closest confidant, heard the truth in late-night phone calls. Shanann admitted she felt isolated, cut off, like her world was shrinking around her. Nicole told her what Shanann already feared. If his parents hate you now, it won't change later. And if Chris is listening to them, you'll never win. Shanann didn't want to believe it. She wanted to think Chris was still the man who once left her notes in the kitchen, who once held her hand through hospital visits, who once promised they'd get through everything together. She wanted to believe his quietness was still love, not distance. But her journals, her tears, and her silence in the middle of the night told another truth. It is easy to believe control always looks violent, but sometimes it looks calm. Sometimes it looks like protectiveness. Sometimes it looks like love, until you realize it isn't love at all. The world still saw perfection. Neighbors waved at Chris mowing the lawn, saw Shanann chasing her daughters down the street, saw the family posing in matching outfits. Online, videos of Bella singing, "My Daddy is My Hero," gained thousands of views. To anyone outside the walls of that house, there were no cracks. But inside, Shanann was writing about isolation, and Chris was finding comfort in control. Shanann thought Chris was protecting her, protecting their family, protecting their future. But who was he really protecting? In every family, there are moments that define whether peace can be salvaged or whether the fracture is permanent. For the Watts family, that moment came not in private, but in public, at a simple barbecue meant to bring relatives together. By then, Shanann had endured years of cold remarks, of silences that cut deeper than words, of quiet disapproval that never softened. But on that day, the hostility left the shadows. It was spoken aloud, for everyone to hear, and once spoken, it could never be taken back. The afternoon began without incident. Smoke rose from the grill, children chased each other across the yard, and the sounds of laughter covered the air. Shanann moved gracefully through the gathering, helping Bella and Celeste with their plates, greeting relatives with warmth, and doing everything she could to show that she belonged. But Cindy watched from a distance, her arms folded, her eyes sharp. The tension was visible long before the words left her mouth. It started with a comment, sharp but disguised as concern. "You hover too much, Shanann," Cindy said, loud enough for others to hear. "You don't let them be kids." Shanann, weary but determined, smiled politely and tried to brush it aside. But Cindy pressed on, her voice rising, each word sharper than the last. "You're not the kind of woman I wanted for my son. You've never been worthy of him." The yard went silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the children seemed to freeze in place. Public humiliation has a way of cutting deeper than private betrayal. In that moment, Cindy's disapproval wasn't just implied. It was declared. Shanann's face flushed. Her hands trembled as she tried to respond. She reminded Cindy of her devotion to Chris, of her love for Bella and Celeste, of the life she had worked tirelessly to build. But Cindy would not relent. "You control him. You isolate him. You make everything about you." Each accusation landed heavier than the one before, as relatives shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to step in or remain silent witnesses. And then came the moment Shanann would never forget. Chris stood by, his face blank, his shoulders tense, but when he finally spoke, his words weren't for his mother. They were for his wife. "Just let it go," he whispered, his eyes avoiding hers. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of abandonment. He hadn't defended her. He hadn't challenged Cindy. He had chosen the quiet safety of his mother's side. For Shanann, the betrayal was complete. Chris's silence that day was not neutral. It was shaped by years of conditioning, by a lifelong instinct to avoid conflict with his mother. To him, standing quietly felt like keeping peace. To Shanann, it was surrender. And in his surrender, she was left exposed. Shanann excused herself soon after, gathering Bella and Celeste in her arms. She carried them to the car with shaking hands, her tears held back until she was out of sight. That evening, she called Nicole Atkinson, her closest friend, her voice breaking as she replayed the confrontation. "She called me unworthy," Shanann whispered through tears. And he just stood there. He didn't say a word. For the first time, she admitted she was thinking of leaving. "I don't want my girls growing up thinking this is normal," she said, her voice cracking with exhaustion. Later that night, Shanann opened her journal. Her words, scrawled across the page, revealed the collapse of a woman who had fought for years to belong. "He looked at me while she tore me apart, and he said nothing. I felt smaller than I ever have. I love him, but love shouldn't make you feel invisible." In another line, written shakily, she confessed, "If I walk away, at least I'll still have myself. If I stay, I don't know what's left of me." Chris, in the days that followed, acted as though the barbecue had been a minor disagreement, a bump that time would smooth over. He repeated the same words he always did. "They'll come around. Just give it time." But Shanann was no longer convinced. Time had not healed anything. Time had only made the rejection louder, more public, and now undeniable. Marriage can survive many storms, but it rarely survives humiliation left unchallenged. Shanann had entered the barbecue believing there was still hope for peace. She left it questioning whether her marriage itself could survive. For Shanann, the image of perfection she had carefully curated was shattering. The smiling family photos, the glowing social media posts, the videos of Bella singing that "Daddy is my hero," they no longer felt like reflections of her life. They felt like a mask. Behind that mask was a woman exhausted, humiliated, and beginning to wonder whether her love for Chris was enough to justify the pain. Affairs rarely begin with declarations. They begin with small choices, a glance held too long, a conversation stretched past its purpose, a secret kept when it could have been confessed. For Chris Watts, the affair began quietly, almost invisibly, in the sterile office halls of Anadarko Petroleum. There, among his co-workers, he met Imani Green. Imani was 25, vibrant, and newly hired. She had an energy that drew people in, the kind of lightness that Chris, at 33, felt he had lost. While Shanann balanced motherhood, business, and health struggles at home, Imani carried no such burdens. She was single, eager, and impressionable, and she looked at Chris not as a husband or father, but as a man who seemed steady, kind, and available in ways she had not questioned. At first, it was casual, small talk during breaks, a joke shared over coffee. But soon those conversations followed them out of the office, onto their phones, into the quiet hours of night. Chris, once so private, now stayed awake long after Shanann went to bed, the glow of his phone screen betraying him. The messages were playful at first, but quickly turned intimate. They created a world separate from the one Chris lived in at home, a world where he felt admired, where no one questioned his silences, where he could rewrite his role from passive husband to desired man. For some, secrecy feels like freedom, but freedom built on lies always comes with a cost. It didn't take long for deception to follow. Chris began claiming late shifts at work, telling Shanann he was handling overtime. He said he was running errands, yet the errands lasted hours. His truck came home with more miles than his routes explained, and receipts appeared from restaurants Shanann had never heard of. Each inconsistency could have been dismissed as stress, as forgetfulness, as coincidence, but Shanann's instincts told her otherwise. She noticed patterns, the gas gauge dipping lower than it should, the faint smell of cologne that wasn't his, a nervousness in his tone when she asked simple questions. When she confronted him, Chris leaned on the calmness that had defined him his whole life. He told her she was overthinking, that her health and fatigue were making her suspicious. He said the quiet words that made her doubt herself, and for a moment, they worked. But Shanann refused to silence her own instincts. She confided in Nicole Atkinson, her closest friend, laying out the evidence piece by piece. Nicole urged her to trust herself, to keep looking, to write things down if she had to. Shanann did exactly that. In her journal, she scrawled, "He's not here, even when he's sitting next to me. He loves his phone more than me. I know there's someone else. In another entry, he says he loves me, but his actions are different. I can't live with this silence anymore. Chris's distance was not only emotional, it was strategic. He reshaped his world to fit the affair. He declined family outings, choosing instead to text Imani in the privacy of his truck. He spoke to Shannon less about their future and more about bills, about responsibility, about keeping order. To him, control meant survival. To her, it felt like disappearance. Imani, for her part, wanted to believe Chris's story. He framed himself as trapped, weighed down by a wife who was too controlling, by financial strain, by a life that no longer felt his own. He told her he longed for freedom, for a second chance. Whether she was naive or complicit is difficult to measure. But she leaned into his story, answering his late-night calls, meeting him at restaurants far from home, slipping into a role that made her part of his deception. Deception rarely belongs to just one person. It is a web, and every strand catches someone. Chris's parents, too, played their part. Cindy, who had long disapproved of Shannon, didn't openly encourage an affair, but in quiet phone calls she told Chris he deserved happiness, that maybe life with Shannon wasn't what he needed. You need to do what makes you happy, she told him one evening, her tone calm but sharp. Don't let anyone take that from you. To Chris, those words felt like permission. To Shannon, overhearing fragments of those calls, they felt like betrayal layered on betrayal. Ronnie stayed silent, as always, but his silence was enough to signal agreement. By mid-2018, the double life was fully underway. At home, Shannon worked tirelessly to keep the image of perfection alive. She filmed Bella singing, posted photos of Celeste's birthdays, and shared long captions about family love. But behind those curated images, her doubts grew heavier. She studied receipts, checked gas mileage, scrolled through phone records when she could, piecing together the evidence that Chris was hiding something. The more she looked, the more certain she became. Trust, once fractured, never returns whole. And in Shannon's marriage, the fracture had grown into a canyon. Still, she wanted to believe it could be repaired. She told Nicole she loved Chris, that she didn't want her daughters to grow up without their father. But her words were tinged with exhaustion. I can't keep doing this, she admitted. I feel like I'm living with a stranger. Chris, meanwhile, grew bolder. He stayed out longer. He spoke more openly to Imani about a future they might share. He began to see himself not as a man trapped in deceit, but as a man on the edge of escape. To him, the double life was intoxicating. To Shannon, it was suffocating. Naomi's instincts were right, but instincts alone wouldn't save her. By the summer of 2018, Chris Watts was no longer living one life. He was splitting himself in two, one as the husband and father the world saw, another as the man who whispered promises to a younger woman in secret. Each day he played both roles, and each day the line between them grew thinner. What began as small lies now hardened into strategy, and what had once been subtle disapproval from his parents became something far more deliberate. Cindy Watts had always resisted Shannon, but now she sensed weakness in the marriage and pressed her advantage. In a phone call that Chris never shared with his wife, Cindy's words carried the weight of a mother's influence sharpened by years of control. You need to start fresh, she told him. You deserve someone who respects this family. She never has. Her voice wasn't raised. It was calm, measured, the kind of tone Chris had learned not to argue with as a boy. He listened in silence, the old patterns returning. Obedience dressed up as choice. Ronnie's role was different, but no less corrosive. He didn't speak with his wife's emotion. He spoke with cold pragmatism. Protect yourself, son, he told Chris. Keep your money safe. Don't let her take what you've worked for. He framed it as wisdom, the voice of reason, but the message was clear: detach, divide, prepare for separation. It wasn't advice for reconciliation. It was preparation for abandonment. Chris absorbed it, letting the words sink in alongside the validation he found with Imani Green. When approval from parents and affection from a lover combine, betrayal no longer feels like betrayal. It begins to feel like destiny. Shannon had sensed for months that something was wrong, but the truth struck with brutal clarity one evening when she overheard what was never meant for her ears. From the hallway, she caught fragments of a call. Cindy's voice, sharp even through the distance. She doesn't respect you, Chris. She doesn't respect us. You can't keep living this way. Then Ronnie's steady baritone. Be smart. Separate your money. Think about your future. And Chris, his reply so faint it might have been a sigh, but to Shannon it was unmistakable, agreement. Her body reacted before her mind could. Her chest tightened, her stomach dropped, her hands trembled. She pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear, willing the words to be different, but they were not. It was betrayal confirmed, not just in the affair she already feared, but in the collusion of a family that had never accepted her. She wasn't just losing her husband. She was being pushed out of her own life by those who should have defended her. That night, Shannon confronted Chris. Her voice broke between anger and devastation. She told him she knew about Amani, about the lies of working late, about the receipts and the mileage that didn't match. She told him she had heard his parents plotting with him, encouraging him to cut her off, to erase her place in the family. And then she drew a line. She would expose him. She would reveal the affair. She would tell the truth, and she would not let his parents poison her daughter's lives. For Shannon, it was an act of defiance, the only weapon left to her. But for Chris, it was a threat to the fragile balance of his double life, a balance he was desperate to protect. Shannon poured her rage and sorrow into her journal that night. Her words were unfiltered, scrawled across the page in heavy strokes. I heard them. They want him free of me. He didn't defend me. He agreed. I know now where I stand. In another line she wrote, if I have to, I will take the girls and go. I will not let them grow up thinking silence is love. The entries were not just records of pain. They were a warning, proof of a woman ready to reclaim her voice. Chris, meanwhile, retreated further into silence. To Amani, he spoke of a future. To his parents, he listened with obedience. To Shannon, he offered the same flat reassurances he had always given. You're overthinking. Things will be fine. But the words rang hollow. He was no longer trying to save the marriage. He was trying to save his second life. And when a man lives two lives, there comes a moment when one must end. The confrontation had changed everything. Shannon was no longer pleading for acceptance or understanding. She was demanding truth, threatening exposure, and daring Chris to face the consequences of his betrayal. But Chris had been pushed, pulled, and conditioned by voices stronger than hers. Cindy's demands, Ronnie's pragmatism, and Amani's admiration all pressed him toward a choice that would shatter more than a marriage. Because in the silence that followed, Chris had already decided that if Shannon was going to end his double life, he would end hers first. For years, Shannon Watts had carried the weight of her marriage, convinced that patience and love could mend the cracks. But now she understood the truth. She was alone in a fight Chris had already abandoned. And for the first time, she stopped hoping for change. She started planning for escape. Her first call was to Danielle Moore. Danielle had been her anchor, the one friend who knew the side of her life that never made it to Facebook. On the phone, Shannon's voice shook. I can't do this anymore, she confessed. I can't keep pretending we're okay when I know he's with someone else. Danielle was blunt in a way only true friends can be. Then don't, she told her. Don't stay. You've given him every chance. If you don't get out now, Shannon, you never will. Sometimes the people closest to us see the danger more clearly than we do. In the quiet hours of the night, after putting Bella and Celeste to bed, Shannon began searching. She opened her laptop and typed in listings for apartments near Frederick and Denver. She compared square footage, rent prices, school districts. One complex caught her attention, just 2 bedrooms, but close to Bella's preschool. She saved the listing, whispered to herself that it could work. Another had a small playground visible in the photos, and she smiled at the thought of her daughters running there freely. Each click was both terrifying and liberating. She went further. She began preparing questions for a lawyer. On a small notepad she kept tucked inside her purse, she scribbled, custody? Child support? Do I need proof of his affair? The handwriting was jagged, hurried, as though even the act of writing could be discovered. She searched for attorneys quietly, scrolling through names, reading reviews. One profile stood out, a lawyer who specialized in family cases, especially with young children. Shannon marked the number, telling Danielle she was going to schedule a consultation. To Shannon, the worst that could happen was divorce, custody battles, and the pain of rebuilding. But sometimes the worst is not divorce at all. Chris, however, was no fool. His life depended on control, and he noticed the smallest shifts. A laptop left open. A search window minimized, but not closed. A note tucked into her purse that slipped slightly into view. He found the listings. He saw the lawyer's name. And in that instant, the careful balance of his double life began to crumble. His reaction wasn't just anger. It was fear. If Shannon left first, she would hold the story. She could expose his affair with Imani. She could cut his parents out of the lives of their grandchildren. She could claim custody of the girls, leaving him isolated, dismantled, and humiliated. To Chris, her searches weren't just a plan for survival. They were an attack on everything he had built, everything he thought he controlled. For a man who had lived his life avoiding conflict, silence was no longer enough. Control had to be taken back. Shannon, unaware her secrets had been uncovered, continued to plan. In her journal, she wrote not in polished reflections, but in sharp fragments, words that felt more like cries than sentences. He lies. He hides. I'm scared. Another entry. Apartment, safe for girls. Away from him. Later, on a night when exhaustion overcame her, she scrawled, I love him still. But love shouldn't feel like this. Love shouldn't feel dangerous. The ink pressed hard into the paper, her frustration visible even in the way her pen carved the page. Danielle noticed the change too. In conversations, Shannon's voice carried a mix of resolve and dread. I just need to get through this week, she told her friend. Once I meet the lawyer, I'll know what to do. Danielle, worried, pressed her harder. Promise me you'll be careful. He doesn't sound like a man who's going to let go easy. Shannon promised, but her tone betrayed the fear she tried to bury. Meanwhile, Chris grew more distant. He messaged Imani with renewed intensity, telling her stories of a future that was beginning to sound desperate rather than hopeful. He called his parents, listening as Cindy reminded him that starting fresh was his only chance at happiness, while Ronnie pushed him to be smart, protect what's yours. Each voice reinforced the same conclusion. Shannon's threat wasn't just personal. It was existential. Control, once threatened, can drive even the quietest man toward decisions no one imagines possible. Shannon continued her secret searches, believing she was laying the groundwork for freedom. But her freedom was already compromised. Chris had seen her plans, read her intentions, and in his silence, he had begun drafting his own response. She thought she was preparing to reclaim her life. In reality, she was stepping closer to danger with every note, every search, every whispered plan. She didn't know her husband was already writing her ending. July 13th, 2018. The date lands like a stamp on a fragile page, and the house on Saratoga Trail settles into evening as if nothing has changed. Outside, a sprinkler ticks across trimmed grass, and a neighbor's dog barks once, then gives up. Inside, the refrigerator hums, steady and low, while the overhead lights wash the kitchen in a warm, indifferent glow. Shannon moves through the room she built with care, straightening a dish towel, checking the lock on the back door, touching the photographs of two little girls whose smiles never fade. She has rehearsed calm, but her chest is tight. She has practiced patience, yet her hands still tremble. She tells herself she will make it through the night, because tomorrow, finally, she will choose herself. At 6:42 p.m., she texts Danielle Moore, the friend who knows the truth beneath the posts and the pictures. We'll talk tomorrow. I need to get through tonight first. The message is short, but it carries the weight of weeks, of secret apartment listings, of notepad questions for a lawyer, of the steady erosion of a marriage she once believed she could save. Danielle stares at the screen, fingers hovering, wondering if a call would be better, wondering if urgency is needed, then decides to wait for morning. She will regret that quiet later. Upstairs, Bella reads the same book for the third time. Celeste cuddles a blanket that smells like sunscreen and summer, and their mother listens to the murmur of bedtime as if drawing strength from it. She thinks of what must be said, and what must be done, and how to say it without breaking herself in front of her children. Chris appears in the doorway with a stillness that looks like peace to anyone who doesn't know him, and he offers a glass of wine with a voice so level it feels rehearsed. The stem clicks lightly against the countertop, the ice settles, and a thin ring of water begins to bloom on the stone. The gesture is domestic, almost tender, yet it lands wrong because tenderness requires truth. He asks if she wants to sit. She says she's fine, then isn't, then says she's fine again. He watches her without lingering, tracks her movements without seeming to track them at all, and his eyes keep returning to the phone in her hand like a reflex he can't disguise. The quiet between them fills the kitchen in slow inches, not the restful kind, but the heavy kind that makes voices sound too loud when they finally arrive. They talk around the real subject first: school supplies, the latest bill, a neighbor's new landscaping, because sometimes the small talk holds the door closed for a few more minutes. Shannon tastes the wine and sets it down untouched, then wipes the ring from the counter with her thumb. Chris nods at nothing, pretends to scroll past nothing, thinks about everything he has seen on her screen: apartment tabs, a lawyer's number, a notepad with jagged questions about custody. He tells himself that calm is control, that breath is strategy, that her leaving would not just end a marriage but expose a double life he has already sold to someone else and promised to himself. His mind moves like a metronome: parents, money, Imani, exposure, and underneath it all a single conclusion clicks: the story cannot belong to her. The house holds its breath, and then the day lets go. Shannon checks the girls one more time. Blanket pulled to a chin, stuffed animal tucked under an arm, door left open the exact width she always leaves it. And then she retreats to the bedroom, because there is no version of this conversation that belongs in a hallway. She sits on the edge of the mattress and rubs her palms on her jeans until they feel warm, and she stares at the framed wedding photo on the dresser as if asking it to testify. Her voice starts too soft, so she starts again, and this time the words arrive in the order she practiced: "I'm leaving you, Chris." She adds what she has learned in the last terrible weeks: "I know about her. I know about the lies. We can do this the right way for the girls." And she hears herself bargain even as she stands her ground. She says the word lawyer without flinching, then the words co-parent with care, and beneath all of it is the plea she doesn't speak aloud: "Tell me the truth, and let me go alive." He doesn't raise his voice. He has almost never raised his voice, and that has always been the trouble, because silence can be a blade when it's used to cut a person out of their own life. His jaw works once, twice, then settles. His shoulders flatten. His eyes go flat the way eyes go flat when a decision has already been made elsewhere. He thinks about his mother's sentence: "Start fresh with someone who respects the family," and his father's calculus: "Protect yourself, protect your money," and then about the messages he sent Imani that made him feel wanted, new, unburdened. He tells himself there is no way back that does not cost him everything he has told everyone else, and that the only way forward is the version where he is not small, not exposed, not the man who lost. Calm sits on him like armor, and he mistakes the absence of feeling for strength. Shannon hears the quiet and mistakes it, too. She thinks the stillness is a place where reason might live, so she tries one more angle, because love and logic often walk together even at the end. "We can make a plan," she says, "and the girls need steadiness, and I don't want a war." And her hands shake now, because the air has changed and her body knows it before her mind catches up. She reaches for her phone and sets it on the nightstand face down, as if refusing to let the rest of the world witness what happens next. She slides her wedding ring once along her finger, a nervous habit that feels suddenly like ritual. The house offers little sounds: an air vent clicking on, a pipe settling, a truck passing far off on the county road. And those sounds make everything more real because life keeps moving around endings. She breathes and waits for words that will not come. He stands without moving, which is its own kind of movement, and the room takes on that strange pressure rooms get when storms stack over the plains. No thunder, no flash, only the sense that the atmosphere itself has been arranged against you. What he calls calm is in fact panic organized into silence. What he calls control is simply the refusal to admit he has already lost the version of himself he sold to someone else. The plan he thought he had. Time to manage appearances, time to rewrite his role, time to make her the one who left, has fallen apart because she reached for the pen first. The refrigerator hums on the other side of the house. The digital clock glows 9:18, and the night narrows to the width of a bed where two people once promised to share everything. She says his name, once, like a question. He does not answer. There is a last chance in every ending, a brief hinge where mercy could live, and it hangs there for a heartbeat while two small girls dream in a room down the hall. Shannon squares her shoulders and keeps her voice steady because courage is sometimes a discipline, not a feeling. And she says, "We will be okay. I will be okay. The girls will be okay." He hears only the threat inside the promise, the exposure, the custody, the consequences, and the calm he wears finally hardens into something else. He steps forward, not fast, not loud, and she understands too late that the quiet she hoped was truce is the quiet of a decision. The ring she slid along her finger moments ago catches a shard of light and then disappears into shadow. The wine glass on the kitchen counter continues to sweat. And that's when the man she trusted most became the weapon she never saw coming. What follows does not belong to dialogue or to witnesses. It belongs to timelines and evidence, and the grim math of investigators who will soon measure a life in minutes and signals and stains. There are no neighbors who hear an argument, no slammed doors, no shouts. There is only a house that keeps its secrets, and a husband whose calm is no longer a mask but a method. Upstairs, a book slides from a small hand and thumps softly on carpet, and the sound is too ordinary to summon help. The clock changes to 9:27, then 9:28, then 9:29, because time continues even when a world stops. In the home she made, within the walls she painted, in the bed where she believed she was safe, Shannon Watts is killed. The room goes still. The glass on the counter weeps into a small, perfect circle. The phone on the nightstand lights, then sleeps, then lights again at nothing at all. Outside, the sprinkler clicks off and the dog settles and the street forgets, because streets always forget until morning brings someone to remember. A mother will not wake to gather her daughters. A friend will not receive the promised call. A story will move forward with a voice missing from it forever. And in the narrow space between night and dawn, in a quiet house that looks like every other on the block, a family's future has already been decided. July 14, 2018. Morning rose over Frederick, Colorado, and the Watts house looked ordinary under the pale light of a Saturday sun. The lawn was still trimmed, the blinds still drawn, and the driveway empty except for a silence too heavy for the neighborhood. But inside, absence lived in every room. Shannon Watts was gone, and Chris Watts, her husband, was already rehearsing the role he needed to play. At 8:43 a.m., Chris picked up the phone. His voice was even, measured, almost as if he had practiced. He told officers his wife and daughters were missing, that her phone and purse were left behind, that it made no sense. He asked neighbors for help, repeated to friends that he was worried, that Shannon would never leave on her own. The words sounded right, but the rhythm was wrong. Too quick, too precise, like a man running lines he already knew. A liar often gives the right details at the wrong time, and that mismatch is where truth begins to leak. The neighborhood started watching. Security cameras, meant to guard driveways and doors, became silent witnesses. At 5:27 a.m., footage caught Chris backing his truck into the garage, something he never did. Shadows moved near the vehicle in odd ways, as if something heavy was being loaded. A neighbor, replaying the clip for detectives, said bluntly, "That's not normal. He doesn't act like that." Another added, "He's too talkative. He's pacing. He looks nervous." Their instincts, simple and untrained, cut through his calm more sharply than any official interrogation. Chris told detectives he had left for work at 5:15, but the video contradicted him. He claimed Shannon was planning to see a friend, but every car was still parked in the garage. He insisted he didn't know why her phone was left behind, but detectives knew phones rarely leave people willingly. Each story had a hole, and each hole widened as the hours passed. Nicole Atkinson, Shannon's closest friend, arrived at the house with questions Chris could not dodge. She told officers flatly that Shannon would never leave her girls, never leave her phone, never vanish without explanation. She pressed harder than anyone else that morning, pointing out every inconsistency, forcing detectives to see the gaps in Chris's story. Where Chris offered vague guesses, Nicole delivered certainty, and her certainty carried weight. Sometimes the voice of a friend is more credible than the performance of a husband. Inside the house, officers moved carefully. They saw Shannon's purse on the counter, her medication untouched, her suitcase by the stairs. The children's beds were neatly made, their toys scattered as if play had been paused mid-motion. The refrigerator hummed, a faint reminder of normalcy, but the air carried unease. Nothing in the house suggested a woman preparing to leave. Everything suggested she had been stopped in place. Chris followed detectives from room to room, his arms crossed tightly, his eyes darting each time a note was written down. He repeated himself, "I don't know, maybe she left, she's been stressed," phrases rehearsed until they sounded mechanical. Yet when officers replayed the neighbor's security footage in front of him, his body betrayed him. His foot tapped, his jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed at the screen. The neighbor noticed. Later he would tell police, "He's not acting right. Something's wrong." Calmness can be rehearsed, but panic seeps out in gestures a man cannot control. The inconsistencies multiplied. Phone records showed Shanann's last messages didn't match Chris's timeline. Camera footage caught movements he had denied. Friends described her plans to leave, her fear of his distance, her notes about an affair. Piece by piece, the image he was selling collapsed. He had tried to stand as the grieving husband. What detectives saw instead was a man too eager to explain, too eager to talk, too eager to control a story that didn't belong to him. By evening, the search was no longer a missing persons case. It was an investigation closing in on the man at the center of it all. The house was secured, the devices collected, and the cameras combed frame by frame. Detectives didn't yet have a confession, but they had suspicion. Suspicion built on the smallest cracks, the places where Chris's story bent under the weight of truth. For a day, he played the role of a worried husband. But evidence does not bend for actors, and the walls around his performance were already closing in. By the fifth day, the search for Shanann and the girls no longer felt like a search at all. Detectives weren't just looking for a missing family. They were circling a man whose story kept changing with every hour. Chris Watts had walked into the role of the grieving husband, but the weight of evidence was pressing in on him from every direction. What he thought he could hide was already beginning to speak louder than anything he could say. The first cracks came with the dogs. Cadaver units entered the Watts home, handlers giving firm commands while cameras rolled. The animals moved carefully, noses brushing along walls, pausing at the base of stairs, circling in the living room where Chris had stood days earlier claiming nothing was wrong. One dog barked near the couch, another froze halfway up the stairs. Each reaction was logged, each moment marked, and the officers in the room exchanged glances they didn't need to explain. Chris watched, his arms folded, his jaw tight, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He said nothing, but his silence carried the strain of a man who realized science could smell what bleach could not erase. A lie can be told in words. A house cannot lie to a dog trained to find the scent of death. Detectives turned next to the phones. Subpoenas pulled every record from the carriers, and the truth unfolded in timestamps. Chris had claimed he left for work at 5:15 a.m. But his phone pinged near the house after that time. His text to Imani Green told a different story than the one he gave police. Late-night promises, coded messages, a man planning a life outside of marriage. Shanann's phone told the story of a woman still rooted in her family. Her last text to Danielle frozen like a haunting echo. "We'll talk tomorrow. I need to get through tonight first." There were no outgoing calls, no digital footprints of escape. Her silence was not freedom. It was final. Money traced his motives as clearly as messages traced his lies. Their joint bank records showed strain, maxed out credit cards, missed mortgage payments, bills piling up faster than income. But his personal accounts told another story. Restaurant charges where Shanann had never been, gas stations far from his usual route, purchases that lined up neatly with Imani's schedule. Detectives didn't just see infidelity in those numbers. They saw desperation, the portrait of a man drowning in debt and reaching for escape at any cost. Financial pressure doesn't excuse violence, but it can press on cracks already splitting, turning selfish desire into lethal intent. When they brought Chris back to the station, the performance continued. The interrogation room was plain, beige walls, a table, 2 chairs, a camera blinking in the corner. Chris sat with his arms crossed, his answers clipped. He said Shanann had been emotional, maybe unstable, maybe she had left on her own. He didn't cry. He didn't demand answers. He didn't ask to search for her. Instead, he repeated the same phrases over and over, as though repetition could turn a lie into truth. The detectives leaned forward, pressing him with the small inconsistencies. Why did the neighbor's camera show his truck moving when he said it didn't? Why did his phone ping at home when he claimed he was gone? Why was Shanann's phone tucked away in a corner of the house she never used? Chris shifted in his chair. He crossed and uncrossed his arms. He scratched at the table, cleared his throat, changed small details of his timeline. Each adjustment was logged. Each pause was noted. Detectives didn't need a confession to see what was happening. They were watching a man try to hold together a script already falling apart. His parents defended him loudly. Cindy told police and reporters that Shanann was controlling, that she was difficult, that her son had suffered quietly for years. She used the word unstable, casting Shanann not as a victim but as a problem. Ronnie spoke less, but nodded in agreement, reinforcing her words with his silence. To them, defending Chris was instinct. But to investigators, their denial only underlined his lack of accountability. And to Shanann's friends, hearing her painted as unstable when she was the one lying in silence was cruelty layered on grief. Family loyalty is powerful, but when it blinds itself to evidence, it becomes part of the lie. The breakthrough wasn't cinematic. It wasn't one piece of evidence dropped on the table. It was the chain of details tightening one link at a time until there was no slack left. Shanann's phone, hidden in the house, carried his fingerprint. The same phone she used to message friends. The same phone she never let out of reach. Now tucked away where only someone trying to erase her voice would place it. Combined with the camera footage, the phone records, the bank statements, and the alerts from the dogs, the case was no longer a puzzle. It was a net, and Chris Watts was trapped inside it. In the room, detectives leaned closer. They repeated the questions, circling him like wolves. Why hide the phone? Why lie about the truck? Why spend money on someone else while your family disappeared? Chris's answers grew thinner, his voice flatter, his eyes darting to the corners of the room. His calm, once rehearsed and controlled, now looked like what it really was, fear wearing a mask. He tried one last attempt to shift blame, saying Shanann had been unstable, that she had hurt the girls, and he had reacted. But the words fell dead on the table. Detectives had already seen the truth in his lies. A confession doesn't always arrive with tears. Sometimes it arrives in the cracks, the hesitation, the shifting story, the moment when silence weighs more than words. Chris Watts was not yet ready to admit what he had done. But by then, the case no longer depended on his words. The evidence had already spoken, and it told a story more damning than any script he could write. The husband who had smiled for neighbors, the father who had stood on porches begging for answers, the man who claimed his wife was unstable. He was now standing against the unshakable weight of fingerprints, cameras, dogs, and timestamps. And the walls around his story were finally closing in. The trial of Chris Watts opened in the fall of 2018, and from the first gavel strike, the courtroom felt heavy with expectation. Every seat was filled, every eye locked on the man who had once been called husband and father, now seated at the defense table with hands folded too tightly. The wood-paneled room was silent except for the shuffle of papers and the creak of benches as spectators leaned forward. It was not just a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning, and the tension moved through the air like static. The prosecution began with a timeline, and their words struck like iron. They told the jury that this was no accident, no sudden collapse of emotion. It was premeditation, they argued, rooted in weeks of deception and quiet planning. They presented his phone searches, late-night questions about finances, about separation, about freedom. They played footage from neighbors' cameras showing his movements in the early morning hours. Layer by layer, they built the image of a man who had not stumbled into murder but walked deliberately toward it. Jurors took notes, glancing at Chris, searching for a flicker of reaction. Premeditation is not always written in one act. Sometimes it is carved slowly, in searches typed after midnight, in promises whispered to someone else, in silence rehearsed until silence itself becomes the weapon. The affair with Imani Green was revealed next, and the room shifted. Jurors leaned in as texts and call logs were displayed on screens. Each line of affection and promise contrasted with the life Chris had been pretending to maintain. They read messages where he spoke of starting over, of wanting freedom, of imagining a future with her. When Imani herself took the stand, the atmosphere thickened. Her voice shook as she explained she believed him when he said he was separated, that he was unhappy, that Shanann was difficult. And when she admitted, with eyes downcast, that she never imagined it would end this way, the silence was so deep that even the hum of the fluorescent lights felt louder. In betrayal, there are always more victims than the one in the grave. Lies reach outward, ensnaring those who believed them, those who trusted them, those who never saw the blade coming. The prosecutors then gave Shannon her voice back. Her journals were entered into evidence, her handwriting projected for the jury. Jurors watched the slanted lines, the uneven strokes, the words that spoke of fear and love tangled together. He lies. He hides. I'm scared. I need to protect the girls. Another page. I love him still, but love should not feel dangerous. Each entry was read aloud, and with each word, Shannon filled the room. Some jurors shifted, blinking hard. Others stared at the page, their pens motionless. For a moment, the courtroom felt less like a place of law and more like a place of mourning. Friends and family followed. Nicole Atkinson testified about Shannon's final text, "We'll talk tomorrow," and said she knew something was wrong the moment that tomorrow never came. Danielle Moore described their late-night phone calls, Shannon's fear, her exhaustion, her secret plans to leave. Shannon's mother, Sandra, spoke through tears that shook her body but not her resolve. She deserved to live, she said, her voice cracking but strong. My grandbabies deserve to live. He took everything from us. The gallery wept with her. Chris did not. Character is not measured only in achievements. It is measured in the grief left behind, in the stories others tell when your own voice has been silenced. The defense offered little that could move the jury. They repeated words like stress, like collapse, like instability. They leaned on Cindy Watts' claims that Shannon was controlling, that she was unstable. Cindy sat in the courtroom, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on Shannon's family with a defiance that unsettled even neutral observers. She whispered to reporters during recess, insisting her son was misunderstood. Ronnie nodded quietly beside her, his silence carrying its own accusation. But the weight of denial could not stand against fingerprints, text messages, and a dead woman's journals. Chris himself sat almost motionless throughout it all. He watched as Imani testified, his jaw tightening just slightly. He shifted when Shannon's words were read aloud, his lips pressing thin, his eyes fixed on the table. But when his mother spoke of Shannon as unstable, he looked up, and for a moment the faintest flicker passed across his face. Not grief, not regret, but something harder to name. To the jury, it looked like a crack in the mask he had worn since the beginning. Closing arguments sealed the narrative. The prosecution reminded the jury that this was not mystery, not accident, but choice. The selfish, deliberate choice of a man who killed to escape responsibility. They walked the jury through the evidence again. The dogs, the cameras, the phone records, the journals. They called it cowardice at its clearest. The defense repeated their refrains, but their words felt small, drifting into the silence left by Shannon's testimony from beyond the grave. On November 19, 2018, the jury returned. The foreman stood, the paper in his hand trembling slightly, and read the words that settled like stone. Guilty on all counts. The murder of Shannon Watts, the murder of Bella and Celeste, and the unlawful termination of Shannon's unborn child. Shannon's family broke down, sobbing openly, clutching each other for support. Cindy and Ronnie sat frozen, their silence louder than any cry. And Chris, the man at the center of it all, stared forward, the mask of calm still fixed, though the story he had built lay in ruins. Justice cannot bring back the dead, but it can give the silence meaning. It can place responsibility where it belongs. It can speak the names of the lost so they are never erased. The sentence followed, life in prison without parole. The courtroom emptied slowly, footsteps echoing on polished floors. Outside, reporters waited, cameras clicked, and the story spread beyond Frederick, beyond Colorado, beyond the United States. The world knew now. The betrayal, the lies, the journals, the truth. Chris Watts was convicted of first-degree murder. But the final word did not belong to him, or to the defense, or even to the prosecution. It belonged to Shannon, in her journals, in her mother's tears, in the voices of friends who stood for her when she no longer could. And as Chris was led away in chains, the silence he had chosen as his weapon became his prison. The verdict had been read, the sentence delivered, and Chris Watts would never walk free again. But justice on paper did not heal the wound left in the hearts of Shanann's family. The court could end the trial, but it could not end the silence of an empty chair at the dinner table, the ache of birthdays that would never be celebrated, or the sound of two little girls' laughter that now lived only in memory. For the Razuseks, life after the trial was not relief, it was survival. Sandra Razusek spoke first, her voice unsteady yet firm. She said mornings were the hardest, when she reached for her phone to check if Shannon had called. I still expect to see her name light up on the screen, she admitted. And when it doesn't, I feel the weight all over again. At night, she walked past a closet where Shanann's childhood clothes were stored, and the smell of old fabric and perfume brought tears she could not control. I want people to know her as she lived, she said, not just as she died. She was more than his crime. Frank Razusek spoke with quiet devastation. He didn't cry easily in front of cameras, but his words cut deep. He told the jury, and later the world, that his granddaughters were his world, and losing them felt like losing the air in his lungs. He described Bella's gentle nature, how she would cling to him and whisper secrets in his ear. He remembered Celeste's playful energy, her loud laugh echoing through the house, impossible to ignore. And now, he said, his voice breaking, the house is quiet, too quiet, a silence that crushes you. His pain was not theatrical. It was steady, relentless, and it forced listeners to confront the human cost beyond headlines. Grief is not neat. It does not end with justice. It lingers in the corners of homes, in the pauses between words, in the moments when memory feels like both gift and punishment. Danielle Moore, Shanann's closest friend, carried her own burden. She replayed Shanann's final text in her mind. We'll talk tomorrow. Tomorrow had never come, and the weight of that message lived inside her like a wound that would not close. She remembered every late-night conversation, every whispered fear, every plan Shannon had made to escape. She deserved to grow old, Danielle said softly, to watch her children thrive, to hold them through heartbreaks, to cheer them at graduations, to dance at their weddings. She deserved that future, and he stole it from her. Her voice hardened then, filled with anger and sorrow joined as one. And I will never forgive him for taking her tomorrow away. When a life is stolen, the victim is not the only one buried. Every friend carries their silence. Every parent carries their absence. Every child carries the story they'll never finish writing. Yet while Shanann's family spoke with grief and resilience, the Watts family clung to denial. Cindy Watts never apologized, never uttered Shanann's name with compassion. In court she crossed her arms, her gaze cold, her voice sharp as she insisted her son had been provoked, that Shannon was unstable. Even after conviction, she told reporters that Chris was a good man, misunderstood, pressured by circumstances. Ronnie, quieter but no less complicit, nodded along, his silence reinforcing her words. Their refusal to grieve with Shanann's family deepened the wound, turning denial into its own form of cruelty. Some families face truth and find a way to heal. Others bury themselves in denial, protecting the guilty while leaving no room for the dead. But Shanann's memory did not vanish into denial. Her parents refused to let her story end at the crime. They started foundations in her name, speaking openly about domestic violence and the dangers hidden behind perfect facades. They shared her journals, her words, her hopes for her children, so others might see the warning signs they had missed. They wanted Shannon to be remembered not as a victim, but as a mother who loved fiercely, a woman who fought for her family, and a friend who gave more than she ever took. In turning their grief outward, they transformed loss into legacy. To speak a victim's name is to resist erasure. To carry their story forward is to honor the life that was stolen. Still, the home on Saratoga Trail remained, an eerie reminder of what had been lost inside its walls. Neighbors passed it daily, some with eyes averted, others staring as though answers might still hide behind the glass. The lawn was cut, the blinds closed, but the house was no longer a home. For many in Frederick, it had become a monument to betrayal, proof that evil could wear the face of a smiling father, that destruction could be born from a quiet man's silence. When love is poisoned by hate, survival becomes a miracle few ever see. As the credits of this tragedy wrote themselves into public memory, Shanann's story echoed far beyond Colorado. Her journals, her friends' testimony, her parents' resilience, these voices spoke for her, louder than Chris's lies, louder than Cindy's denial. They reminded the world that justice is not the end of grief, that silence is not safety, and that betrayal is often closest to home. Do you believe family disapproval can ever justify destruction, or is it only an excuse for cruelty? The screen fades to black. A photo appears. Shanann, smiling, her arms around Bella and Celeste. The words of her final text hover on the screen, "We'll talk tomorrow." The laughter of children echoes faintly, then fades, leaving only silence. The trial was finished, the sentence pronounced, and Chris Watts would never walk free again. Yet for Shanann's family, justice was only a word on paper. Grief remained jagged, not smooth, and it struck without rhythm. In the mornings when Sandra reached for her phone to see if her daughter had called, or at night when Frank sat in silence, staring at the empty chairs where his granddaughters once laughed. Courtrooms bring conclusions, but grief does not. It lingers in breaths, in pauses, in photographs that will never change. The montage begins with Shanann in life. In one photo, she holds Bella close, her face lit with the quiet pride of a mother who loved deeply. Another shows Celeste tugging at her hair, Shanann's laughter caught mid-frame. Then the sonogram appears, Nico's tiny shape blurred but undeniable, a life that was never given the chance to begin. These images are not about crime. They are about the everyday beauty Chris chose to destroy. They remind viewers that before evidence, before courtrooms, there was family. Every victim has two stories, the one told in police reports, and the one told in birthday candles, home videos, and journals filled with dreams. The screen shifts. Courtroom sketches take the place of photographs. Heavy pencil lines show Shanann's parents, shoulders drawn inward, their grief sketched into every angle. Another shows Chris, expression flat, posture stiff, as if carved from stone. Cindy Watts is captured with arms folded, her eyes sharp, her mouth set tight. Ronnie sits beside her, silent, his face unreadable. These sketches are raw and imperfect, but they reveal truths a camera cannot always catch. The cold denial of one family, the crushing grief of another, and the unsettling emptiness of the man who caused it all. The house on Saratoga Trail appears next. Not the inside, not the evidence, but the exterior, blinds pulled, the lawn neatly trimmed, standing too still under the Colorado sky. Neighbors pass, some glancing quickly, others staring too long, as though trying to read the walls themselves. At dusk, shadows stretch across its windows, and the house looks less like a home than a monument to silence. What was once ordinary now feels haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of betrayal. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waters the lawn, waves to neighbors, and tucks children in at night. The montage returns to Shanann. Facebook clips show her smiling, her voice warm as she speaks proudly about her family. She looks into the camera with the confidence of a woman who believed in love, unaware that love had already become her greatest danger. Her daughter's laughter plays faintly over the images, not staged but real, pulled from home videos where life was still untouched. Then the laughter begins to echo, louder, layered, almost unbearable in its innocence. And just as it fills the screen, it cuts to silence. On the screen, Shanann's final text to Danielle appears. "We'll talk tomorrow. I need to get through tonight first." Behind it, her photograph fades in, her smile steady, her daughter's arms around her shoulders. The message dissolves, but the smile remains, holding on a second too long before fading to black. His parents hated her. Chris Watts made sure she never survived. And yet, the question remains, how many other lives are destroyed in silence, when family hate becomes the deadliest accomplice? The credits begin, laid over photos of Shanann and her daughters, birthdays, vacations, ordinary moments. Their voices are gone, but their presence remains, forcing viewers to remember not the crime scene, but the lives stolen from it. Justice wrote the sentence. But grief will never close the book. Remember Shanann. Remember Bella. Remember Celeste. Remember Nico. And remember what silence can cost.